Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We're back. Today I want to talk about the laws of sex, marriage, and divorce. All of these are pretty heavy subjects, especially in the modern day. There's a lot of tension surrounding these issues. But as always, when faced with chaos and difficulty, the place to turn to is God and His Word. And what I want to demonstrate to you today is that, in fact, if you were to follow the Word of God when it comes to the laws of sex, marriage, and divorce, you would actually be looking at a much simpler and more free lifestyle where the individual is the master of their own fate, and you actually get to choose, for the most part, who you're going to sleep with and how that'll happen. Now, of course, there are red lines that you cannot cross in the Torah. You have incest, you have bestiality, you have homosexuality, you have adultery. These are things that you cannot do under any circumstances. But when it comes to straight relationships, male, female, having sex, being intimate, being together, the laws are actually not as clear-cut as you might think. Now, of course, religious institutions always try to stifle people and suppress them. And when it comes to the sex drive, that would be the chief drive in a person. And so, of course, you have the religious systems completely controlling everyone's move that they make when it comes to engaging with the opposite sex. So, for example, I grew up ultra-Orthodox Jewish, and they would tell us that you are not allowed to talk to a girl. You are not allowed to touch a girl. You are not allowed to be alone, secluded in a room with a girl. All of these laws are not in the Torah, completely made up, but they are ways to just enslave people in their own lives so that instead of being free to interact as yourself with the opposite sex, you now have to worry that you're not even allowed to be alone with them, or you're not even allowed to touch them. And so let's just talk about the laws in the Torah. There is a misconception that sex outside of marriage is some sort of cardinal sin, that it's some sort of horrible thing, that if you would do that, your child would even be a bastard, God forbid. Well, it turns out that there is no prohibition in the Torah that says thou shalt not have sex outside of marriage. It's just not there, right? The Torah has restrictions on sex, and that is not the case, that you're not allowed to have sex outside of marriage. Now, of course, marriage is the best thing. It's the ultimate unification of male and female. It's the commitment to one another, the building of the family, the discovery of the soulmate, the development of a relationship over an extended period of time, possibly even a lifetime. Nonetheless, when it comes to men and women engaging with one another, it has to be clear that that is absolutely allowed. And not only is it allowed, but it is our nature, and it should be encouraged to the extent that people are not being promiscuous. And this is the one point that I do want to talk about, because this is actually a Torah source. And so we have here the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 23, verse 18. There shall not be a harlot female from the daughters of Israel, and there shall not be a harlot male from the sons of Israel. So harlots, whores, obviously people that do that for money, prostitution, that's obviously included in this. But let's take it even a bit further, because whoredom and prostitution can take forms not just monetary. A person can be a whore even if they're not taking money for it. So what's being said here is that people that have set aside themselves to be illicit in their sexuality, to be what would be called promiscuous. Promiscuity refers to the general act of sex that is not treated with its proper discretion and not given the level of importance that it really has. Because of course, sex is a very severe thing, and it's a very important thing that men and women would have to choose carefully And so when sex becomes casual and people start having multiple partners and they're all over the place and they're not treating sex with any level of severity whatsoever, that's where you start to venture into a world of people being promiscuous. And of course, the Torah says there shall not be promiscuous daughters amongst Israel, and there shall not be promiscuous sons amongst the children of Israel. And that is a very significant statement, and that should be taken seriously. And so when you go about interacting with the opposite sex and you're becoming intimate, you're becoming sexual, just remember that you have to take that seriously. And it can't just be a promiscuous thing where you're now just a whore and you're just fucking around, as they say, just for the sake of pleasure and immediate gratification without understanding the act that you're actually involved with. Now, I think it's wise to point out that within the umbrella of promiscuity, there is going to be a slight variance for men and women. Because even though this commandment is said to both men and women equally, ultimately men and women are different in their nature. And just to give you one very obvious example is that men do not have virginity, right? Women, they have a physical virginity, the hymen, right? And in the Torah, a woman's virginity is regarded as something sacred, and virginity is important. And so for a woman to lose her virginity, that is far more severe than for a man to have sex, because men do not have virginity. They can even have multiple wives, as opposed to a woman cannot have multiple husbands, right? And so we're already seeing that there is a difference between men and women based off of their nature, their physicality, their spirituality, their purpose in this world. And so definitely women should be careful in guarding their virginity. And if a woman were to lose her virginity, she would have to be honest about that. But it's something that could happen. It's not a sin, but again, something to be careful about for sure. One of the interesting guilt trips that religions take people on, and particularly for young men, they will tell young men that if you spill your seed, meaning if you were to masturbate or have sex outside of the purposes of procreation, you would be committing a sin. The mystical books of Judaism, including the Zohar, which people regard as being this book of great secrets, goes so far as to say that the worst sin in the Torah is spilling seed. In the Talmud, you have statements saying that people that spill their seed are deserving of death. Really absurd, ridiculous statements that are being said with such conviction that the worst sin in the world is spilling seed. Except there is no sin in the Torah that says you're not allowed to spill your seed. Not at all. And the only source that people bring is a source referring to the sons of Judah. Now, I will read the story for you here, and you can take from it what you will. But it's very clear for someone who reads this story objectively that the sin in the story was not spilling seed. So I'll tell you the story. Judah took a wife. She gave birth to 3 sons. And the names of the sons were Er, Onan, and Shelah. Now, Judah took a wife for his firstborn Er, and her name was Tamar. Now, Er, the firstborn of Judah, was evil in the eyes of God. No mention of what his evil was. God put him to death, killed him. Now, in the Torah, and Judah was even aware of this, that God's will is when a brother dies without any children, his widow should actually go and marry his brother, and then his brother can have a child under the name of his deceased brother that died with his brother's wife. So Judah told his second son, Onan, come unto the wife of your brother and establish offspring with her under his name. And here is the verse that is taken out of context, and people lie about this being about spilling seed. Genesis chapter 38, verse 9. And Onan knew that not to him would be this seed. This offspring would not be his offspring, it would be his brother's offspring. And so what he would do is, when he would come to his brother's wife, he would destroy his seed onto the floor so as not to give seed to his brother. And so clearly, Onan here is at fault for deliberately not having sex with his brother's wife and coming inside of her because he wanted to make sure that he would not establish seed for his brother because he knew that wouldn't be his seed. So he's like, no, I'm not going to do it. That was evil in the eyes of God, and God put him to death as well. That's the story. And so people say, well, clearly the sin that Onan did was that he destroyed his seed onto the floor. And that's what his sin was. But for anyone who reads the story, they will see that Onan's sin was not spilling seed. His sin was the fact that he refused to establish progeny and offspring for his brother, which is God's will in the scenario, that he was supposed to have children under the name of his brother, and he chose not to do that. So you can clearly see just how sinister the agendas get to put a ridiculous level of sexual shame onto young boys, onto men in general, telling them that spilling seed is the worst sin in the Torah, when that's a complete lie. Complete lie. It's not a sin at all in the Torah. Now, we can just make a couple obvious points about spilling seed. In the case of masturbation, masturbation is not a sin, but let's just be honest. Sex in its pure form, in its true form, happens between a man and a woman. If a man, or a woman for that matter, is solitary alone in their room masturbating, it's not a sin, but it's also really not the full realization of sex and what it's supposed to look like. So people shouldn't be too enamored with masturbation. It really sucks. And so I'm not sure why, we should be so obsessed with it. We now have a porn culture where people are compulsively masturbating with visual stimulation, and it's really all very bad for the health of humanity and society. So I encourage men and women to get together and have sex together as opposed to having solo sex. As far as, spilling seed to the floor, it's not a sin, but again, best case scenario, you're with someone who you want to have children with. After all, sex is the act of procreation, the very first thing that God told man and woman when he created them. This is in Genesis chapter 1. When he created man and woman, this is God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply. All right, so of course, this is God's will for human beings. And so, best case scenario, you're with someone that you want to have children with. And we should actively be seeking out those relationships. And genuinely, a society where marriage has become fractured, men and women are not getting married anymore, it's not a healthy society. It's not good, and it's not conducive of an environment to raise children. Children need a home, they need a father figure, they need a mother figure that are unified, and monogamy is not a requirement in the Torah because, again, men can have multiple wives. Even some very great men in the Bible had multiple wives. But let's just take the model that God created at the beginning of time, Adam and Eve. Man and woman. There wasn't Adam and 3 Eves. There was just one man, one woman, become one flesh. That's what God tells us to do. So monogamy, although not required by the Bible, clearly does seem to be the model that God has set, and it would be best if we could fulfill that. And there's a lot that can be accomplished between a man and a woman if they were to live in a monogamous lifestyle where they just have each other to grow with and to develop, and their children can see a unified front of masculine and feminine in their parents. Now, again, getting back to this distinction between men and women, which is a key component in understanding nature, because we live in a world where everything needs to be egalitarian, everything needs to be equality. There's an active attempt to get rid of the obvious differences between men and women. But this is really a satanic agenda to oppose God in his creation. And there is a misconception about adultery, that adultery is equal for men and women. So if a married woman were to cheat on her husband, that would be adultery. And if a married man were to cheat on his wife, that would be adultery too. However, that is incorrect. Biblically, adultery only applies to a married woman. And so I'll read it to you here. Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10. And a man who shall commit adultery with the wife of another man. If he shall commit adultery with the wife of his fellow, they shall surely be put to death, the adulterer and the adulteress. So a man who sleeps with another man's wife, that is the scenario of adultery. And both of them, both the man and the woman, are put to death for committing adultery. But adultery is only for a married woman. And so a man who sleeps with a married woman, he's guilty of adultery. But a married man who sleeps with an unmarried woman, that is not adultery. And again, men could have more than one wife. So how could it be adultery for men to sleep with other women? Of course, the argument could be made that if he gives a promise to his wife that he's not going to sleep with other women, then he'd be breaking his word, he'd be lying, he'd be dishonest, he'd be unkind. All that's correct. But adultery, that's another story. That's the 7th commandment of the 10 commandments. That is punishable by death. So let's just be clear on the standards here. God created different standards for men and women. Men and women are different. Men hold the masculine role, women hold the feminine role. And that comes with the responsibilities dictated based off of how you were born and what gender you are. Now, to dive into marriage and divorce, because marriage, as it's been defined by the rabbis or by the priest or by the government, is all about having a certification from some institution that you've gone through their process of marriage, and they proclaim you to be married. Now, again, I'm not saying it's the worst thing to have documentation of marriage and to have systems that are involved with certifying marriages, but let's just talk about what marriage is. Marriage is the commitment between a man and a woman. It is a man giving a woman the status of a wife, because in the Torah, there are 2 statuses for a woman. There is a concubine and there is a wife. A concubine is a woman who you sleep with, who you can even have children with, but she's not your wife. To give wife status to a woman, now that introduces real commitment. Now you have to provide for her. Now she's exclusive to you. Now there's adultery in the picture if she were to cheat. All of that takes on a whole new measure of meaning when we're referring to marriage. And so marriage is absolutely encouraged. And let's see here what it says, though, if a man no longer wants to be with his wife. This is Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1. If a man shall take a woman and become her husband, and it shall be, if she does not find favor in his eyes because he found in her a matter of immorality, then he shall write for her a document of divorce, put it in her hand, and send her away from his household. So here you have the process of divorce. And it's specifically if the man finds in his wife a matter of immorality, because men can't just go ahead and divorce their wives for no reason, on a whim, because they're disinterested in her. Not at all. The commitment of marriage is a commitment through thick and thin, through sickness and health, through ups and downs. That's the whole point of marriage. And so what's being said here is that a man can only divorce his wife if he finds in her a matter of immorality. And that is actually a valid reason for her to not find favor in his eyes. And what he has to do is write her a document of divorce, put it in her hand, and send her away from the house. And so again, we're not even seeing this being a court case or being some sort of official court document. It is actually just a document between him and her. He hands her the document, sends her away from his house. And so the only good argument to be made for having some sort of ceremony surrounding a marriage or surrounding a divorce is that you have witnesses who see this proclamation, who see the man saying, I take you as my wife, and the woman saying, I am your wife. And in the case of a divorce, people witnessed this divorce, that it took place, so we now know that she's a divorced woman. And witnesses are a very important thing. In the Torah, witnesses actually establish matters. As a rule, 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter shall be established. So let's just point out a very obvious thing, though, which is that if someone were to get married They would tell their parents, they would tell their siblings, they would tell their friends, they would tell their neighbors, they would tell their community. And very quickly, it would be known that these people are married. And so the idea that you would need to go through some official process in order to have witnesses to your marriage is incorrect. If people witness you living together as a married couple, and they witness you walking together and both saying in unison, yes, we are married, we're married now, well, then you have all the witnesses you need. And the same thing goes with divorce. If people see that you split up, that you're no longer living together, and the man says, I'm divorced, the woman says, I'm divorced, she has this piece of paper that he gave her, the document of divorce, that's all it takes to authenticate the process that it went on. And so these areas of our lives, these intimate relationships that we have, we're given immense freedom by God to act freely in our relationships and to sleep with the people that we want to, and to marry the people that we want to, and to divorce the people that we want to in the context that God provides. And so again, another what would be controversial thing about divorce is in the Torah, men can divorce their wives, but women can't divorce their husbands. And before you come yelling at me, what if he's abusive and all these things? Well, sure, there's a court system and there's law enforcement if there's some real criminal activity going on. But as far as just a woman being like, I want to divorce my husband, that's not in the Torah. In the Torah, men marry their wives, men divorce their wives. And again, it's giving a great burden of responsibility to men and a great burden of submission to women. When women actually become wives, they have to understand just how significant of a commitment that is. And they should do it willingly and knowingly that this is a man that they want to be exclusive to, and this is a man that they want to spend the rest of their life with. And so it comes back to remaining true to the Word of God, engaging in relationships that are sanctioned by God. And if you are in a relationship that is sanctioned by God, meaning man and woman, not promiscuous, not adulterous, holy and sanctioned by the laws of God, you are given the freedom to interact with care, but also with comfort, knowing that as long as you remain committed to the laws of God, then you will not be transgressing His will, and you have the ability to experience the totality of your humanity without being clamped down upon by religious institutions and secular institutions and all of the higher-ups who would just love to control your sex life and what goes on in your bedroom and what goes on in your personal relationships. But that's not the substance of the Torah. The Torah empowers the individual to follow God's law. So let's read and reread the 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, without adding or subtracting. Just read the words that are written, and you will be enlightened as to how you should behave. God bless.